Our highlight for tonight, of course, is to hear from the Farsi spokesperson for the State Department. Can you believe it? We have a Farsi spokesperson at the State Department. Isn't that great? Some of you who watch VOA online probably know that Alan is a phenomenon in Iran right now. His show, as Alan Beporsid, is one of the smash hits on VOA right now. And the State Department really could not have chosen a better person to do this. Those of you who know how the State Department works, of course, also know that one of the traditions, not just for the US State Department, but for almost all foreign services, is that they don't like people when they get too knowledgeable and specialized. They like to keep people more having a general level of education. But there's nothing general about Alan. You will see that the depth of his Farsi is quite amazing. I know some of you who have spent some time just tonight speaking to him, hear him use these expressions that really no one in our community regularly uses. It's just amazing. And it's, of course, tremendously important as well because of the policy. One of the great difficulties between the two governments and the peoples is the difficulty of communication, and the mere fact that the State Department has now this level of expertise, both linguistically as well as culturally, is a great, great step forward, particularly compared to just a few years ago. I met Alan first, I think, sometime in 2003 when I was on Capitol Hill, and we had an opportunity to speak. And ever since seeing him master not only Farsi, but also Azeri when he was stationed in Azerbaijan, and just being absolutely stunned and impressed with everything that he's been able to accomplish. Now, you guys probably want to stop hearing me speak and actually meet Alan, so I'm not going to take more of your time. Alan, the floor is yours.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. Let me start then. Esteemed NIAC board and members, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege to be here in front of you tonight. I'd like to thank NIAC both for inviting me and for putting together today's events, which I found very informative and as well as a great chance to catch up with old friends and to meet new friends. As someone who's been following events in Iran and socializing within the Iranian diaspora for almost 30 years, it's a real pleasure for me to see the Iranian-American organizations, including NIAC, that have sprung into existence to help Iranian Americans, to help Americans better understand Iran, and to help the Iranian people. I commend Shrita Parsi and his NIAC colleagues for seeking to play this role, to fill this gap, and to fight the fights that need fighting. So congratulations to NIAC. Now, before I begin my prepared comments tonight, I have a sad duty to note the passing this Saturday of a respected State Department colleague and a dear friend of many of ours, Philo Dibble, who was our Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran. Philo was deeply involved in formulating and implementing Iran policy, and his wisdom and his leadership was in large measure responsible for its best elements, to include both our constant efforts to hold Iran accountable for its human rights violations and our public diplomacy efforts to reach out to the Iranian people. He was the rarest of individuals, and his wisdom, his wit, and his essential goodness will be sorely missed by all of us who knew him, and I hope the remarks I've prepared for you tonight will do honor to his memory and to his vision. Now, when Trita asked me to address this group, I initially jumped at the chance, since the idea of speaking publicly in English instead of Persian seems so easy. I mean, no worries about saying dor instead of dar, no fears about dropping the conjugation of the verb budan off of long sentences. I thought that speaking in English would be, like we say in English, like playing tennis with the net down, or as we say in Persian, mesle ab khordan ast. But then I thought a little further and realized that my speaking to you in English might be a mixed blessing. To the extent my statements as Persian language spokesman have any interest for Iranians, I suspect it's only in part the desire of the Iranians to find out what the US government position is on any given issue. In part, I fear it's the amusement value of seeing what a hash I make of the otherwise rich and beautiful Persian language when I speak it, or as one of my Iranian friends puts it, samad sokhan gumishe. In any case, when deciding whether to speak to you tonight in Persian or in English, I thought I could do what many of you do every day, which is speak in this Shotorgov Palang language of Finglisi, half Persian, half English, where I would be uttering such sentences as Emshab mikhom give a speechy bokonam, dar morede problem ha va opportunity haye mojud nesbat be talash haye public diplomacy dolat America. I see you all got that, right? Yeah. But in the end, I decided to stick with my mother tongue, although if a few Persian phrases do slip in, I beg your indulgence and begole shoma mano forgive konid. So, anyway, I think we're all familiar with the U.S. government's and the international community efforts to convince the government of Iran, government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to change its policies concerning its nuclear program, its relationship with its people, and its relationship with the people and the governments of the region. The Iranian government doesn't seem to want to change these policies, so we're engaged in a diplomatic effort, along with much of the international community, to encourage them to change their strategic calculation and to choose to become a more productive and responsible member of the international community. Rather than repeat what most of you know already about our efforts to convince the Iranian government to change strategic course, what I'd like to talk a little about tonight is our attempts to reach out to the Iranian people, why we're making these efforts, and finally how the Iranian-American community can help. First of all, I think it is indisputable that the United States government is making a concerted and sustained effort to communicate directly with the Iranian people. Now, admittedly, this is not a concept or an effort that this administration has pioneered, as previous administrations have also sought to reach out to the Iranian people. But I think we've increased the scope and tempo of these efforts, and I'd like to give you a few examples. The highest level U.S. government officials often make announcements directly to the Iranian people. Ever since he's been president, President Obama has delivered a Persian New Year, Nowruz, speech to the Iranian people. As he himself said in his most recent speech, each year of my presidency, I have marked this holiday by speaking directly to the people of Iran. You, the young people of Iran, carry within you both the ancient greatness of Persian civilization and the power to forge a country that is responsive to your aspirations. Your talent, your hopes, and your choices will shape the future of Iran and help light the world. And though times may seem dark, I want you to know that I am with you. Similarly, Secretary of State Clinton often makes statements specifically for the Iranian people. When she recently changed the visa regulations, allowing many Iranians to get 2-year multiple entry visas, she filmed a message announcing these important changes, in which she said, "We want more dialogue and more exchange with those of you who are shaping Iran's future." The State Department has also been very active in outreach to the Iranian diaspora, to include listening closely to its concerns. No better example of this can be found than the recent changes Secretary Clinton made, allowing these 2-year multiple entry visas for many Iranian student applicants. As she said in announcing these changes, "I've heard from many Iranian students and Iranian-Americans that you wanted this change. So I want you to know that we are listening to your concerns." A related example is immediately after the visa policy announcement, when we partnered with NIAC and with another great Iranian-American organization, the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian-Americans, PAIA, to do in-person presentations on these changes in Washington and in California. The State Department has also been very quick to seize on the possibilities offered by social media. And I'll give you a few examples here. It's launched the USA Data Farsi brand, which can be found on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, And USA Farsi allows us to quickly and broadly cover policy issues, react to breaking events, link to translations in Persian of US policy statements, and to host interactive events like Twitter interviews or regular features such as the one with which I'm most familiar, Ask Alan, as Alan Beporsid, which is a monthly video where I answer questions from Iranians on various topics. Some of the topics we've covered so far are US visa policy, Iran sanctions, and US government Middle East policy. Another example of the State Department's use of social media relates to Iranian students interested in continuing their studies in the United States. The State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs has an incredibly resource-rich Persian language website, educationusairan.com, which has everything an Iranian student needs to know about coming to study in the United States. And one of the benefits of this social media is not just that it gives us new ways to push out our US government talking points, it also allows two-way communication with Iranians, and believe me, we pay attention to what we hear from them. For example, in response to a cascade of Facebook messages from Iranians, we quickly became aware of and were able to change US government public documents which use the term Arabian Gulf instead of the official US government term, which is... There you go. This was just one example of when social media allowed the US government to hear from and to react to the concerns of Iranians. I spoke earlier about the high-level government officials such as President Obama and Secretary Clinton speaking directly to the Iranian people. Additionally, as we talked about, the State Department created the position in April of this year of Persian language spokesman, which I've been fortunate enough to fill, and it's been a real honor for me. Creating this State Department Persian language spokesman position allows the State Department to more routinely communicate directly with the Iranian people in their own language, or the best approximation of their own language that I can manifest. Since the spokesman position was created, I've been fortunate enough to appear on Iranian expatriate media such as BBC Persia, Persian News Network, Radio Farda, and Deutsche Welle's Persian service, in addition to websites such as Mardomak. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, I also filmed this Ask Alan video where I answer questions. There seems to be an audience for such a spokesman position. I'm told that the behind-the-scenes video I did with the hosts of VOA's great and wildly popular show Parazit received 65,000 views its first day online, and that the monthly Ask Alan video gets an average of 4,000 views a month, although I suspect a lot of these hits are from my mother, who is quite proud of me and has a lot of free time. I should point out up to now that, not surprisingly, US officials have not been afforded uncensored access to Iranian state media. But we will keep knocking on that door until it opens. And even if it doesn't, we will point out that, for example, when President Ahmadinejad comes to New York annually for UNGA, he has full and unfettered access to US media, appearing on almost every channel except Nickelodeon. But as of yet, the Iranian government won't allow US government officials to appear on Iranian state-controlled media to explain US government positions. Now, social media lives on the internet, and Secretary Clinton has stressed that as far as she and the State Department are concerned, access to the internet is one of people's basic rights, combining key elements of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. As such, the State Department is spending much time, effort, and money not just to get information out to the Iranian people, but to tear down the electronic curtain, satellite jamming, and internet censorship that the Iranian government seeks to erect to prevent its own people from communicating with each other and with the rest of the world. We're doing this through diplomatic measures, through provision of technology, and through public diplomacy. I hope I've made a convincing case that the United States government is making a concerted and sustained effort to communicate directly with the Iranian people. I must note, though, that this virtual interaction is no substitute for people-to-people exchanges. We at State Department are still seeking to promote people exchange programs with Iran on topics ranging from sports to solar energy. Unfortunately, we've had to ramp back these efforts to bring Iranians to the US as part of these programs due to the Iranian government's specious claims that we use these programs as part of a soft war, jangin narm, against the Iranian government. As far as the travel of ordinary U.S. citizens to Iran, while it goes without saying that the hospitality, mehmon navazi, of ordinary Iranians toward Americans is undeniable, unfortunately, American citizen travel to Iran is not an option the U.S. government can recommend at this time. Be'omid Khoda, one day more Americans can and will travel to Iran to experience firsthand the friendliness and warmth of the Iranian people and the beauty and grandeur of the Iranian country and culture. Having never been to Iran, I hope to be one of those people. Having, I hope, shown that the U.S. government is making this concerted and sustained effort to reach out, the question then that asks itself is, why? Why is the U.S. government going to all this effort? The U.S. government and the international community communicate concerns about Iranian government policy, either directly or indirectly, to the Iranian government. So why do we seek to establish links with the Iranian people? Doubtless for many Iranians, the answer would be that we're doing so because Iran is the most important country in the world. Or, as Graham Fuller puts it in the title of his excellent book, Iran is the center of the universe. While I would never disagree with such a sentiment in front of such an audience, I would prefer to put it this way. 1, it is in the interests of both the United States and Iran to have an Iranian citizenry that is informed, connected to each other and to the rest of the world, and empowered relative to its own government. 2, it is in the interests of both the United States and Iran to have an Iranian government that is responsive to, that is accountable to, its own people. 3, the U.S. government believes that by seeking to communicate directly with the Iranian people, we can help achieve these two goals. Now, please note that I am not saying that the purpose of our outreach is to foment insurrection amongst the Iranian people, that we seek regime change. That is not the case. What we want, what we believe is in the best interests of both the American people and the Iranian people, is a vastly strengthened connection between the Iranian people and the Iranian government, and between the Iranian people and the rest of the world. Please also note that it is the U.S. government's working assumption that the above is not the case, i.e., we believe there is a fundamental disconnect between the Iranian government and the Iranian people, between Dolat-e-Iran and Millat-e-Iran. It would be one thing if the U.S. government could assume that an Iranian citizenry, fully informed of events both domestically and internationally, was actively participating as citizens in the formulation and implementation of its government's policies. However, we do not think that is the case. The Iranian government seeks to limit and control Iranians' access to news and information. It seeks to limit and control Iranian citizens' ability to communicate both with each other and with the outside world. And finally, the Iranian government seeks to prevent its accountability to its own citizens and to deny its own citizens a formative role, a determinative role, in fixing the future of the Iranian nation. So yes, the U.S. is deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear portfolio. Yes, we are deeply troubled by Iran's treatments of its own citizens. Yes, we are profoundly disturbed by Iran's attempts to benefit from regional instability. But the U.S. government believes that by having an Iranian citizenry that is informed, connected to each other and to the rest of the world, and empowered relative to its own government, and by having an Iranian government that is responsive and accountable to its own people, these problems would be able to be solved much more quickly. William Morgan Schuster, a century ago, observed wryly in his great and tragic book, The Strangling of Persia, that, and I quote, "In diplomacy, a given policy must be either moral or successful." Well, this administration believes that is a false dichotomy. As President Obama put it so well in his May 19th speech about the Middle East and events that have shaken it up, failure to speak to the broader aspirations of ordinary people will only feed the suspicion that has festered for years that the United States pursues our interests at their expense. We have a stake not just in the stability of nations, but in the self-determination of individuals. He also said in the speech, the status quo is not sustainable. Societies held together by fear and repression may offer the illusion of stability for a time, but they are built upon fault lines that will eventually tear asunder. Indeed, what the Iranian poet Malek al-Shu'ara Bahar wrote about Iran and the need for reform during the constitutional revolution almost 100 years ago can now be said of the whole region. Ya marg ya tajaddud و اصلاح راهی جز این دو پیش وطن نیست. ایران کهن شده است سراپایی درمانش جز به تازه شدن نیست. And for those of you who don't speak Persian, the quick translation of that is either reform or progress. There are no other options for our homeland. Iran has grown thoroughly old. There is no cure but becoming new again. President Obama and Secretary Clinton have each repeatedly pointed out that if governments want the goal of stability, the only way to reach it is through justice. This relationship between justice and stability, between citizens enjoying their individual rights and societies flourishing, is not one that the US government has just now discovered. You know, I was originally drawn to Iran and to the Persian language because of its poetry, and I think one could easily write a book, maybe Trito will write it, because you're writing so many books, titled All I Ever Learned About Life, I Learned in Divan-e-Hafiz or Golestan-e-Sa'di. Well, Sa'di knew well the relationship between justice and stability. As he wrote in Golestan, Padshahi ke tarh zulm afkanad, pay divar mulk khish bekanad. A ruler who establishes oppression destroys the basis of the walls of his own reign. Now, US government officials have often quoted Sa'di's lines etched on the walls of the United Nations about how we are all connected to each other. We all know this one, Bani Adam azay yek digaran ke dar afarinish ze yek goharand. What I'd like to do, though, is quote the lines immediately preceding these, which are not as well known. Haran ke tokhme badi kesht o cheshme niki dasht, damaq bihude pokht o khiyal batil bast. Ze goosh panbe brun ar o dad khalq bede. Vagar to mi nadehi dad, ruzi dadi hast. Whoever sows bad seed and expects good fruit has cudgeled his brains for nothing and begotten vain imaginations. Pull the cotton from your ears and administer justice to your people, for if you fail to do so, there is a day of reckoning. So this is why the US government continues to reach out to the Iranian people, even at a time when it seems as though they play no role in forming their government's policies. We do it because it's in the interests of both the United States and Iran to have an Iranian citizenry that is informed, connected to each other and to the rest of the world, and empowered relative to its government. It's in the interests of both the United States and Iran to have an Iranian government that is responsive to and accountable to its own people. And we think that by seeking to communicate directly with the Iranian people, we can help achieve those goals. Now, I wouldn't be a good US diplomat if I didn't finish by giving you unsolicited advice on how to live your lives. Ya be qol ma dars hikmat be luqman hakim bedam. As such, I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts on what the Iranian-American community can do to help both its country of citizenship and its ancestral homeland. The good news is, to a large extent, you're already doing it. You're organizing. Organizations like NIAC, like PAYA, like AIC, these are all good examples of Iranian-Americans organizing to make a difference. Organizations don't need to be focused on politics. Cultural work is just as valuable, especially considering the new generation of Iranian-Americans born or raised here in America. It would be a real loss were Iranian Americans to grow up unaware of their rich cultural heritage, unable to speak Persian, deprived of the ability to enjoy the poetry of Hafiz and Sa'di, to watch the films of Kiarostami or Doye Napoleon, my favorite, to listen to the classical music of Shajarian, or for that matter to the rap of Hijkas, Yas, or Shahin Najafi. Alongside with organization is cooperation, i.e. the need for expatriate Iranians of all stripes to work together. For too long, the Iranian diaspora's effectiveness has been lessened by internal feuding. If we're hoping for an Iran where people of different beliefs can cooperate and work together in forging a common future, let the Iranian diaspora be a sterling example of how that's done. Next, continue to reach out to your friends and family back in Iran. While Iran's future will ultimately be determined primarily by those Iranians still living in Iran, the Iranian diaspora can play and must play a supporting role, in part by serving as a voice for those Iranians back in Iran who cannot make their voices heard outside their own country. It's important for the US government to know what you as American citizens think, It's also important for you to tell us what Iranian friends and family back at home are saying and thinking. In conclusion, Iranians have often believed that Iran's fate is decided pushte parde, in closed rooms by the great powers that beqol ma'ruf kar English host. But this belief, even if it were true, is certainly true no longer, and believing in it can cause a fatal passivity. Let us make no mistake, Iran's future will not be decided by Washington or by London. Its fate will not be set by ayyad ajnabi, by foreign hands. It is the Iranian people who must determine their own fate. As President Obama said when talking earlier this year about regional changes in the Middle East, the United States will not be able to dictate the pace and scope of this change. Only the people of the region can do that. But we can make a difference. We must stand alongside those who believe in the same core principles that have guided us through many storms. Our opposition to violence directed against one's citizens, our support for a set of universal rights, including the freedom for people to express themselves and choose their leaders, our support for governments that are ultimately responsive to the aspirations of their people. So the United States, believing there is no contradiction between our nation's interests and our society's values, will continue to reach out to and stand alongside the Iranian people, believing that with our help, they can make a difference, and that one day, as Hafez said so well in one of my favorite poems, Yusuf gom gashte baz ayad be Kan'an gham makhor, kolbe ahzan shabar ruzi golistan gham makhor, in dil gham dide halish beshavad, dil bad makon, ven sar shuride baz ayad be saman. Thank you very much. You're too kind.
A lot of our members, a lot of people in the community ask about, and in our conversation with the State Department, we have often repeated, but I'm going to repeat it here again to ask you, because I don't think we've had that direct conversation. After the U.S. government and Secretary Clinton announced a change in the single entry visa policy and made it multiple entry visa, you saw what an amazing reaction that had, both inside the country amongst the young people, as well as in the Iranian-American community and beyond. And it was, at the end of the day, a relatively simple change, but boy, was the benefit and the reward for that in terms of soft power tremendous. Now imagine, beyond the messaging and things of that nature, if there was also some changes in the way that Iranian Americans are affected by the way they are increasingly difficult to legally be able to help their family members with financial contributions, or having a change in the policy of spare parts for airplanes. We all know how many Iranian airplanes keep on crashing. What is the thinking of the State Department on this? From where I stand, it seems like a pretty simple measure that would win a tremendous amount of goodwill amongst the population.
My favorite color is blue. No, that's a very good question. I mean, for those who didn't hear the question, basically what Trita asked was, what else is the United States government doing to ensure that the actions we're taking against the Iranian government don't negatively impact on the Iranian people, and in terms of sanctions, in terms of OFAC, in terms of Boeing spare parts. And I'll say this not just because it's a talking point, but it's true. To the extent possible, we're trying to target the Iranian government in our sanctions. We know that that's not fully successful. I mean, tozi evolves a hot again. You know this better than I do. But we're continually seeking to refine that effort. So we're working with OFAC. We're working, with other entities. So when we see issues of the unintentional deleterious consequences to the Iranian people of the actions we're trying to take as part of our dual-track policy, with which you're all familiar, to increase the pressure on the Iranian government so they'll change their strategic calculations, we're trying to fine-tune it. And so when you have examples, do tell us. But again, and I have to be honest, it's not going to go away. There will always be some negative consequences. We will try our best to minimize them, and your telling us about those will help. Does that answer your question? And again, for the Boeing spare parts, I mean, as we've always said, Iranian planes are not crashing because we refuse to sell spare parts. There are procedures, there are mechanisms for selling the required parts for safety reasons. So, they're out there, and it's up to the Iranian government to avail themselves of those mechanisms and those procedures. So I hope that answers your question. The question was basically that the U.S. government is not distinguishing between the Iranian people and the Iranian government, and that the American people need to be educated about this difference. My point is, I'm the Department of State, a Department of State spokesman. My job is not to educate the American people. That's your politicians' jobs. That's your job as organized Americans. So really, the State Department exists to interface with the rest of the world. So if you feel that the American government is not sufficiently educating its own citizenry about the difference between the Iranian government and the Iranian people, that's one of the great things about our society and our culture is you have fora to do that. And that's one of the great things that NIAC is doing in terms of organizing Iranian Americans to make a difference. So irrespective of whether that's true, it may sound like a cop-out, but it's not my job to try and educate the American people. But your larger point is right, which is the distinction must be made. So thank you for that question. The question related to our recent announcement, well, not that recent, about granting Iranians 2 years of multiple entry visas. The question is this for Iranians seeking to study non-sensitive and non-technical fields? So what she was asking was, how does one understand what are sensitive fields and what are technical fields? That's a very good question. That's one I hear all the time. And my answer is that the interviewing officer, there are guidelines and standards that we have that are promulgated, I think, at some of the websites I talked about. Education USA Iran speaks more to that question, and we've got it on our websites. And I'll post as part of this the URL. So to an extent, the information is out there on things like Education USA Iran, but also the interviewing officer, when you do your interview at the time of applying for a visa, it's his or her job to look at what you're studying and compare it to the standards. So yeah, I know it's very vexing and it can be confusing at times. If we're not doing a good job of putting that information out there in websites, we'll do a better job. But it's also, there is some gray area. So I hope that answers your question.
Feel free, Alan is sitting over here. I'm going to make you available to everyone.
Sure. Thank you all very much.
I really want to thank you for coming. Thank you.